So we'll just wait a few seconds for attendees to join. How has everyone found Pride Month this month? I appreciate it's been a little different because of COVID.
Yeah, I think New York is very different compared to the other years. Of course, last year it wasn't anything, but the New York City, Manhattan is very different this year. But there were still something, but not like the other years.
Yeah, big celebration in New York recently, I think, wasn't there? I saw some videos and that, which looked really good. But
yeah, I think Boston's been pretty quiet this year too.
Yeah,
I think maybe back
no parade.
Yeah, when things were meant to be starting to be organized, no one really knew what was going to happen. So here we are.
I think they're hopefully back to big celebrations next year, though. That's awesome. So yeah, welcome to everyone who has just joined. You should see a poll coming up on your screen, so do feel free to answer that, and we'll share the results shortly. So, are you a member of the LGBTQIA+ community? So, if you want to pop your answer on the poll, it'd be great to see who's in the audience. Brilliant. Super. Well, good afternoon or good evening to everyone, I suppose, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to BioTalent Social's first ever Pride webinar. So tonight we're going to be discussing the topic of tolerance versus acceptance of the LGBTQ community within the life sciences. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Kaylee. I'll be host and chair of today's webinar. I'm also a consultant at BioTalent, specializing in both biotech and pharma recruitment across the East Coast of the US. I'm really passionate about opening up the conversation around the LGBT community within the life sciences industry. As you know, a member of the community myself, I feel I'm always learning, and I've been given full support to delve deeper into discussion that can shed light on how we're perceived and supported within the industry, if at all. So over the next hour of panel discussion, we want to make sure this is as interactive as possible. So there will be a live Q&A throughout. Feel free to pop any questions that you have into the chat box. We'll try and get through as many as possible. There's either a chat box or a Q&A box, so use either. And there'll also be a series of polls like the one you saw at the beginning, designed to gain some insight into your views, which will pop up on the screen from time to time. And there'll be a bit of time as well for networking afterwards. So for those of you who want to continue the conversation, feel free to join that. There'll be a link in the chat that will be sort of popping up every once in a while. So you can join that following the webinar. Super. So over the last 50 years, the attitudes and the treatment of the queer community have developed, they've evolved, and ultimately they've vastly improved. But today we're going to focus our discussion around how queer people are now perceived and treated within the life sciences industry. So is there now like more widespread acceptance, or is it merely tolerance of the LGBT community? So a survey by two researchers from the University of Minnesota found out that out of 1,400 respondents, 92% described their workplace as safe for LGBTQ people, and 85% said that their workplaces were either welcoming or provided an environment where they were treated the same as their straight colleagues. So that's a much higher percentage than the general workforce, where a US survey by the Human Rights Campaign Foundation, only 53% felt that they could be open about their sexuality to a few colleagues. So while 85% of people feeling like they receive equal treatment is higher than other industries, that does still leave 15% facing unequal treatment. And until that number is 0%, there is definitely still work to be done. So the aim for today is to raise awareness, to facilitate change by having a meaningful and respectful discussion on what support there currently is for the queer community, understanding personal experiences and reflecting on the progress that thus far has been made and what more there is to do. So before we kick off, please do note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded to our BioTalent Social YouTube channel, where you can also access our previous webinars if you'd like to give any of those a watch. So with further ado, I'd love to introduce our wonderful panel, who are all currently based on the East Coast of the US. So if you could each introduce yourself with your name, your pronouns, your job title, and your favorite thing about Pride Month. So brilliant, let's start with you, Mark.
Great, well, thank you for inviting me to this webinar, Kaylee. My name is Mark Charbonneau. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the head of quantitative biology at Synologic Therapeutics in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And my favorite thing about Pride Month is the casual showings of support that you see, just sort of walking around the neighborhood and seeing Pride flags up or ribbons around in the neighborhood just to show their support. I love that.
Amazing. Yeah, it's really nice to see. Brilliant. Next then we have Cassie.
Hi, I'm Cassie Satow, and I work for PTC Therapeutics. I am Associate Director of Investor Relations there. I use she, her pronouns. And I think I would echo what you said, Mark, sort of just generally like seeing the flags everywhere, you know, driving through neighborhoods, seeing like all the pride flags up and the different variations on the theme, and just generally people seeing a little bit happier when they see like my family out and about, and that's pretty nice.
Awesome, amazing. Super, thank you, Cassie. Next then we have Zach.
Sure. Hello, my name is Zach Blaze. I use they, them pronouns. I am a knowledge management specialist at Takeda based out of Lexington, Massachusetts. And I guess being in the learning and training field, Pride Month for me is a great opportunity to help educate people who may not be as aware of kind of LGBTQ issues as might be ideal. You know, there's a lot of focus on things that that cisgender or, you know, non-LGBTQ people may not otherwise see.
Definitely provides a good opportunity to do that. Brilliant. And last but certainly not least, we have Anindya. Oh, you're on mute.
Hi, I'm Anindya. I use he, him pronouns. I am the director of discovery and preclinical development at Prevail Therapeutics, which is based in New York. And I think for me, Pride is, I think it always reminds me growing up in 90s in India and how far we have come. So I think it is, as everybody said, that work is not done yet. But I think I am thrilled every year, this time of the year, that how far we have come compared to how I grew up in 90s in India.
Brilliant. Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you all for coming, for joining us, and for those introductions. It's great to have you all here today. So yeah, let's we'll move then onto the discussion. So the main theme of this webinar is, you know, as we say, tolerance versus acceptance. And you should now see, for attendees, a poll popping up on your screen. It'll be there for about 60 seconds, so do select your answer. So do you feel that there is more tolerance or acceptance towards the LGBTQIA community in the workplace? So as mentioned, it's great to gain some insight into you guys watching and how you, yeah, how you perceive this as well. Okay, super. So 70% then have said that they perceive it as acceptance. 30%, so that's nine voters have said that they perceive it more as tolerance, which is, you know, really interesting that that's you know, nearly a third viewing more as tolerance. So I'd love to start off with discussing, you know, the words tolerance and acceptance mean to you guys. So Mark, did you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. In anticipation of the webinar, I was reading an article about tolerance versus acceptance, and this article was actually arguing that acceptance is not a strong enough term, and we need to move towards understanding. And so I think in reality, there's a gradient of attitudes that can exist towards queer people in the workplace. And so, we don't necessarily have to draw a line, but when I think about tolerance, right, that is sort of the bare minimum. That's the permission to play. You can work here, and you'll be allowed to do that. But from my perspective, tolerance has a limit, right? So it's okay up to a point. Given my particular viewpoint, towards the queer community, and I think in a tolerant environment, it also means that if someone fully embraces their identity, they're at risk of sort of facing a discount in terms of in the workplace, right? Like they may be seen as less competent or less like leadership material. And that's in contrast to an accepting or an understanding environment where, not only are people embraced for their identities, but they're encouraged to really bring their full self to work.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I like that. Yeah, as tolerance is up to a point, and it's definitely not, not the aim here. Anyone else would like to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I think it's good to see that so many people feel accepted at work. I think that's really, really great. But I think acceptance here, to me, it's a little complicated, because I think because of social media and changes that we have seen, I think people are very accepting or understand two boxes, being gay or being lesbian. But beyond that, our community is much, much more diverse. There are non-binary people, there are transgender people. So I think acceptance is still limited to these two boxes because our popular culture has kind of popularized it. So I think we have to go beyond that, and all of us have to actually make the effort to understand that we are just not these two boxes.
Definitely, yeah. I think understanding the more widespread nature of it. Anyone else like to weigh in? Super. So according to nature.com, a survey of more than 25,000 researchers found that LGBTQIA plus scientists are more likely to experience harassment than their straight or cisgendered counterparts. And this harassment has caused many to suffer from insomnia, depressive symptoms, work-related stress. So, what do you guys think as a society, are we becoming more accepting towards LGBTQIA folks in the workplace, or do you perceive more tolerance? Zach, should we start with you?
Sure. So I'm a person who lives with depression, anxiety, and insomnia, and at least some of that is because of I don't know if you'd call it discrimination or aggressions in the workplace. Anecdotally, in a previous job, I caught my supervisor using a slur to describe me to my teammates, and that's kind of the low end of what I've seen as far as acceptance goes. And in contrast, I have another anecdote I'd like to tell later for another question, but over the past few years, I've seen a lot of movement toward acceptance, and not just, as Mark said, tolerating somebody because you have to and because you can't tell them they can't be there, but rather in order to celebrate differences, I guess not only in LGBTQ identities, but also in race, in age, in background, all sorts of different things.
Yeah, gosh, well, I'm sorry that you've experienced that with your colleague, but no, absolutely. So Cassie, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it depends on how you define society too, right? So like, I'm speaking from a place of like incredible privilege. I live in the northeast of the United States, which is a fairly accepting geography generally. Obviously, there's still work to be done. But for example, my company is a worldwide company. And I know that there are colleagues that I have that work in offices in other countries where they may be, sort of like less, may veer a little more towards the tolerance or even sort of back into intolerance. So I think it's really hard to say, like, societally are LGBTQ folks being more supported or not. You know, there's just like so much variation within how you define society.
No, definitely, and it varies so much, as you say, across the world, across location, which definitely makes it more hard to define. Yeah, would anyone else like to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I mean, just to second what Cassie was saying, I think that, you know, it is important to sort of zoom into what is the sector of people that you're talking about, because I do think that particularly if you're in the Northeastern United States or you're in the life sciences, there's an enrichment for people who are going to be more accepting of, you know, LGBTQ people. Not everyone's in that environment is one thing. But I think, you know, even in these sort of accepting or more accepting environments, relatively speaking, there are different degrees of, you know, like that spectrum. It's just sort of like, where are you on the slider, right? And I think that there can still be pressures, group pressures or social pressures to conform to the norm and the behaviors that people are supposed to have or fit into those gender stereotypes. And if you don't, then, you know, you can be discriminated against in certain ways.
Yes, I think some direct aggressions are often easier to deal with, in the sense that you can kind of face that. Some of the microaggressions where you kind of know that you have been discriminated against, but you don't know how to vocalize that, how to actually go to the HR and talk about it. I think that is somewhere we all, again, as Cassie pointed out, we are more privileged, but I think I've seen that again and again, that that is how we deal with that, how we'll deal with microaggressions where we know we have been discriminated against, but we can't really vocalize that. So I think that is something that we all need to work on and kind of help each other in such instances where it's not very clear, but you know it. So.
No, absolutely. No, I totally agree. Super. Anyone else want to weigh in on that before we move on?
I guess one thing to add, kind of going back to the issue of depression and anxiety in LGBTQ communities, a lot of people in workplaces that are lower on that slider, that show less acceptance and maybe even less tolerance. There are a lot of situations where there isn't really mobility for people in our communities, which can contribute a lot to, you know, a feeling of hopelessness or, you know, feeling like things aren't going to get better. And, you know, obviously that can lead to a lot of depressive, anxious thoughts, a lot of insomnia, a lot of, how do I want to phrase it? You know, things along those lines. And that's a big part of why it's important to be accepting in the workplace rather than tolerant or rather than intolerant, is because for a lot of people in the LGBTQ communities, there may be less mobility. There's less ability to move from one job to a more accepting one and so on.
No, that's so important. No, right. Fantastic. Okay, brilliant. And I know that obviously there's differences as well between tolerance and acceptance within academia and within industry, and then that definitely varies. And I know that, you know, in the academic world, early studies from sort of 2009 carried out by Bill Amoria and Stewart suggest that there was a don't ask, don't tell attitude when discussing sexual orientation or identity. Whereas sort of 10 years later, so 2019, Inago Academy found that straight men entering STEM fields in universities, 26% of them ended up leaving the program, whereas for queer male students, 40% leave the program. So, you know, Mark, do you feel there was a difference in attitudes towards sexuality and gender in academia versus now in industry?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I mean, I think in general, academia tends to be more liberal and open-minded. I personally haven't experienced a significant shift in moving from an academic role into a biotech industry role. But that I attribute to a couple of different factors. I think one is that I've worked in smaller companies that tend to have like a younger workforce and be the companies are smaller, so that the individuals are tighter with one another. It's less siloed. I think the other aspect of it is around passing, right? I think that often I pass until I self-identify as a member of the queer community, and that, you know, is an advantage, right? Because I don't necessarily experience the same biases that other people experience, just by virtue of being who they are. Now, that being said, you know, I've talked about this with colleagues internally, and not everyone has that experience. I've spoken with other colleagues of mine who are members of the community that, you know, they mentioned that this job that they have now at this smaller company, this is the first time they've been able to bring their full self to work and demonstrate that identity and embrace that in the workplace and have that be accepted. And that in other workplaces, they've either directly been told or been advised in secret to essentially conform and to fit the norm. And that's, you know, that is the best way to get by in those more conservative organizations. So yeah, I still think that it's you know, it's heterogeneous, but I do think that in many organizations there's work to be done.
Absolutely. No, thank you. And Cassie, I know you've spent sort of quite a bit of time in academia as well, and have just sort of made that transition into industry. How have you found sort of the shift between the two?
Yeah, so just for context, I taught at a small liberal arts college for 7 years before I transitioned to industry. So I have a lot of thoughts about this. And I think that, as you said, Mark, generally academia tends to be much more liberal. Although I also haven't noticed much of a shift, mostly because the people that I work with now are former academics, right? It's sort of the pipeline. But I will say that generally, I think there's a difference just considering the focus of the institution. Like in academia, in whether it's college or graduate school, like one of the sort of main missions of academia is to help the individual discover themselves and their passions and their talents. And it's a little bit more focused on self-discovery. You know, it's whether you like chemistry better or biology better, because those are the only two options, right? Or you know, like what types of sports you like, what types of activities you like, and what your personal identification is. So that's a major part of the academic journey, right? We may think it's about like learning the amino acids, but it's really about discovering who you are. But in industry, you know, everyone that I've met has been completely open and welcoming about anyone's, you know, sort of personal lives, but also like we're all there to do a job. We're all there to make medicine, and we're all there to do it, you know, do a great job and do it properly and do it quickly and really all focused on outcomes. So there's less of that like individualization in the workplace. This is just one aspect of it.
And I suppose the focus then, as you say, the shift is very different from focusing on growing and evolving people to as you say, you're there for the science and to do that job. So it becomes sort of less of a focus. It's really interesting. Zach and Anindya, did either of you want to weigh in?
I don't know if I have much to contribute to this one. I haven't noticed much of a major shift myself. I suppose I'm in kind of a large corporate space, which tends to be more open-minded and more accepting in my understanding. But yeah, I think that's all I have for that.
I think for me, I have gone to school in Northeast and also work in Northeast, and everybody's pointed out that it's probably geography dependent. So my experience is kind of limited, but talking to peers, I have seen that just even academia, how liberal are they, and that also depends on what geography they are in to some extent. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, brilliant. And so, you know, something that you touched on briefly, Mark, then was about, you know, being able the difference then when you are sort of straight passing and the ability to be your authentic self at work. So you should now all see a poll again popping up on your screen of, do you find it easy to be your authentic self at work? And I think, yeah, this very much is something that varies depending on person to person and academia to industry, and something that needs work and to be built on. But it'll be interesting to see, see the thoughts of the audience and how, if they feel that they can be their authentic self.
I'll just, while we're waiting for that poll to come in, just an additional thought, proselytize a little bit about the straight passing piece. I think that it's a double-edged sword, right? I think like on the one hand, if you are a person if you're a queer person who passes, there are certain benefits that you get as per being sort of by default part of the cis het community, right? But the flip side is that you end up in situations where you're coming out to people all the time, right? And so, sometimes I'm a little bit jealous of people whose appearance or affect kind of broadcast that they're part of the community, because I often find myself in a situation where I have to start the conversations with, generally start by telling them I have a husband, just so we can get it out of the way. But that's an experience that you do again and again and again.
Yeah, I'm chuckling because I feel exactly the same way. It's like sometimes you want to be able to say like, hey, me too, when you run into other people who are in the community. But it is sort of awkward to, drop sometimes, like, it's easier if you have a partner, or like, I can say like my girlfriend and I went away this weekend, but that doesn't always come up in conversation. So yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, that, and also avoiding the one thing I've noticed is when people misassign, like people ask me all the time, what does your wife do? Right? I say, oh, well, my husband's he's a data analyst. And they'll say, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm like, you don't have to be sorry. It's, I'm telling you, it's okay, let's move on. We don't need to spend any more time on this.
Yeah, exactly. So I remember when I was looking to make the transition to industry, I attended a panel very much like this with a bunch of LGBT folks in leadership in biotech. And one of the women who was on the panel she's like, I just drop my wife and I into every conversation because it saves other people embarrassment. She's like, I just don't want there to be any misconception. Like, she's like, I'm very straight passing. I just want people to understand. So there's no confusion, and then it's just easy. So I thought that was an interesting strategy.
No, definitely. It's it does seem to be the way if you drop it in towards the beginning of conversation to get it out there, and it does then avoid those sometimes awkward conversations that do come up. But so with the poll then about being your authentic self at work, we had 74% felt that they could, 13% felt that they can't be their authentic self at work, with 13% not being sure if they could or not, really. So that's that's a 26% of the audience that are either not sure or don't feel that that's something that can then be the case. So people often find it challenging to be their authentic selves at work. And in a study conducted in the US just earlier this year, it was found that LGBTQ STEM professionals are less likely than their non-LGBTQ peers to have adequate career resources and opportunities for career advancement. And they're more likely to have experienced devaluation of their professional expertise than their non-LGBTQ peers. So why, to the panel, why do we think that is? And I suppose, what do you feel are the circumstances that make people feel as though they can't be out at work? Anindya, should we start with you?
Yes, I think first off, being out, I think my experience is probably a little bit more complicated because I'm an immigrant, which is probably very clear from my accent. I'm a person of color, which is also very clear. But as Mark was saying, being straight passing, the way we grew up, some of us, that we deliberately wanted to be straight passing because we did not want to face harassments as we are growing up, because it was and it is a different world. So coming out, so being an authentic self is at work is also complicated, because I feel like what I have felt that I was being my authentic self, but I was not out because there was not an opportunity to have out myself in a way. Because as I said, that when my first job, I didn't have a partner or a wife or a husband to talk about. So I did not really know how I am actually going to bring that in a conversation. And that is years ago, but now I also feel that some people who do not want to come out at work, we should be respectful of their choice because that is their choice. Having said that, I think for us, it is the onus on us to actually create that environment where people feel comfortable to be out at work. And I understand, I think, the struggle that people face, because it is always scary not knowing what is on the other side. Because if you are, I mean, you might work in a very progressive work environment, but you still don't know anybody who is a queer person out there. So you have no idea what if you actually come out and talk about yourself, what repercussions is going to face. So I feel lots of us who has more privilege, it is the onus on us to make it sure that this is an environment that is conducive, and if people choose to come out at work, they should be able to do it. But it's hard. I think it's hard because it's unknown. We don't know what is on the other side. Like anything else, that unknown is scary.
Yeah, and I think both the stakes and the importance of coming out and sort of living authentically for people in leadership roles at companies is also tricky, you know, because it's on one hand, if you have someone who's in a leadership role, who's visibly, you know, out, that's great representation for the company. But for that individual, the stakes may also be very high for sharing that, because again, you don't know what the consequences might be for that. So I think, you know, just something to think about, that's a difficult position to be in, but a pretty important one to consider.
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely. And I think this gets back to something that Zach was saying earlier about, you were talking about mobility. I wasn't exactly sure if you meant mobility between roles or like sort of mobility vertically in a company, but, you know, part of that, I think, issue is not having necessarily role models, right? Leaders in your company or leaders in your career who are living their authentic, you know, they're being authentic, their authentic self at work and being out as an example, right? And so I think that if you are in a leadership position, you're not required to do anything, but it does a lot of good for the people who are more junior in the company if you can create a space where, well, if they can do it, then I can do it.
I definitely think, yeah, especially if you don't have people who are out in your workplace, then that is that unknown. And the same with sort of progression. If you don't see those people in those roles, it does create that unknown, which is, yeah, a scary thing to walk into, especially when it could put your career at risk, amongst other things. So definitely. And I mean, I suppose, how have you guys found it, you know, have you found that you've found it easy to be your authentic selves at work?
Yes, I did, but I would always still say that there's always a scare there, because as many people pointed out, that we are coming out again and again and again and again. At a point of time, it gets annoying that times you have to come out. But every time there's a new person you are coming out to, you say that, oh, you know, I don't want to get into a prolonged discussion about who I am. I don't want to defend myself. So you always, that coming out, that issue is always there. And the person may be really, really accepting, but you always think that, oh, do I want to deal with this again?
I think this is a little bit of a non sequitur, but I know for me personally, I had a lot of trouble, you know, coming out not only at work, but in my life, because of media portrayals of queer people. You know, I don't want to go off too much on it, but there's a lot about queer coding of villains in movies, for example, where the villain is always, you know, an effeminate man or a butch woman, or, you know, a lot of those traits are kind of associated with villainy in movies or in TV shows or whatever else. And to kind of have internalized that growing up, it makes it that much more difficult to keep coming out to people, you know, and as Anindya said, needing to defend yourself, or feeling the need to defend yourself at least, because that may be how people see other queer people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I definitely think, as you say, so the media has that effect on people's portrayals, and then seeing that does influence how comfortable you'll then feel, as you say, to come out to them.
And the good news is, you know, that's getting better. You know, the increase in visibility of, you know, good gay characters or good transgender characters has gotten a lot better over the past few years, and that hopefully will make it easier for people to come out as time goes on.
Yeah, I think another element of, or sort of dimension of comfort with being your authentic self at work is kind of around how established you are, right? Because the stakes seem higher at first. Like when you're brand new to a job, first of all, there are all the unknowns that the others have discussed, but you haven't established your own credibility in this workspace yet, and established yourself. But later on, so like now I've been at my company for several years, and so I've established I've got credibility at this company, so I'm going to be myself, right? And that's how it's going to be. If I get a new job, the first couple of months, I don't exactly know that I'll feel as comfortable as I am today, because there are so many unknowns in that environment. And I think that's something that every person has to sort of gauge for themselves.
Yeah, speaking as someone who's been at my company for 6 months, I did check with about maybe 4 or 5 people at my company before committing to do this panel. I was like, should I do this? Is anyone going to care? And universally, they were like, absolutely do it. That's great. Like, congratulations, which is great. But there is that like little voice in your head of like, should I do this? Should I say this? Like, can I say, my partner, my husband, my wife, what, before it actually sort of comes out into the open.
Yeah, no, I definitely think, as you say, because it changes every time then that you change company, you have that once again each time. But I've just had a question pop into the Q&A box of asking, what has my experience been being my authentic self at work? And I've been very lucky. I've worked in a few places, this being my first of really within the life sciences, but I've always been very lucky with being my authentic self at work, in that I mean, it's kind of like Mark says, when you are so straight passing, it does make it a lot easier, which has been the case for myself. But every workplace that I've been in has been, very, very open and accepting. But my experience as well has been the thing of, coming out once again, each time it comes into conversation, sort of dropping something in there, and not trying to make, a big conversation of it, just to sort of let you know that. So yeah, thank you for whoever asked. Fantastic. So moving on then to, what are organizations doing to help? What are companies doing to help? We're all members of different organizations within the life sciences. So what are your companies doing to help, and how are they showing allyship? Zach, would you like to start?
Sure. So I just had the pleasure of working on Takeda's gender transition guidelines, which is an HR policy that gives guidance for managers and for colleagues of transgender employees who are coming out at work, and helps to explain how to support those employees, how to respect those employees, including using correct pronouns, enforcing a responsible dress code that doesn't force a person to wear something that doesn't suit them. It describes restroom usage, locker room usage, all those sorts of things that as a cisgender person, one may not even recognize as something that needs attention. So organizationally, that's really nice, to know that the company is there and says, yes, we know that you're here, and we support you, and we're not going to fire you, because in about half the US you can still be fired for being transgender with no legal recourse. So yeah, in the organizational sense, that's a big deal. It's also, I found, in place in our in the people at the company. I just had a really wonderful experience with my manager. I had come out as using they, them pronouns after we had just finished all our annual performance reviews, and my review was written up and finalized and everything. And when I went into my meeting to discuss it, my manager had gone back proactively and changed all of my pronouns to make sure that was correct. And that goes back to what I believe Mark said at the very beginning about acceptance versus tolerance. A tolerant person wouldn't do that. A tolerant organization wouldn't have the system in place to do that. And on the other hand, acceptance is something that it means celebrating the diversity that a person brings to a team or to an organization or to any other group. not only based on queer identities, but also on, like I said before, race, age, background, and the other number of characteristics.
So I suppose going past that point of not just tolerance, not just allowing queer people to exist in that space, but to actively, engage with that and to provide, that kind of support. That's really, really brilliant.
Yeah, I think I can extend on that a little bit in a different way. I think understand the intersectionality of our experiences, as Zach was saying that about race, gender, and color. I think recently, last year and this year, there has been a lot of news and a lot of work being about a BLM movement. And our work, I'm very proud that they have actually made an effort to engage all the employees in that kind of conversation, inviting speakers from outside actually to talk about it. So I think those kind of conversations, which might not be directly about being LGBTQ or being queer expensive work, actually really helps understanding that intersectionality about all our experiences.
Absolutely. And I suppose what do we feel then that organizations should be doing to help more, and things that they should be implementing?
Well, I think that the example Zach gave about the guidelines for managers of how to work with transgender employees, particularly as they're going through transition, that's fantastic. I'm not aware of any other company that's done that. And I think that I would love to have those sorts of guidelines, for my organization or for anyone. I think that's really, that's a fantastic step. I think another thing that organizations can do is encourage the use of pronouns, right? So that you can normalize, even for people who are cisgendered, it normalizes the use of different pronouns, right? So that when people are in the situation of identifying, if they're using pronouns that maybe a person wouldn't expect, that they don't have to feel that that's unusual to be saying that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would reiterate just normalizing pronoun usage as a thing, because even if you already know the pronouns of everyone you're in a meeting with already, right? First of all, that can change, or just normalizing that conversation can lead to more acceptance in people's sort of broader lives also, because there may be someone who has a child who's coming out, or a sibling or a friend, and just giving, sort of everyone in the organization the tools to do that, like a guide of how to support someone who's coming out as trans, like great for managers, but also why couldn't that be available to everyone in the company? Because this is sort of a life skill also. It's not just applicable to work. So I would say, like, the more that companies can do to provide resources for education, the better. Like, we have these monthly education seminars at my company, and this month, of course, was about Pride, and it was about the history of Pride and like what people can do to be a good ally. We have an LGBTQ group that people can join, so it sort of raises visibility. But like those educational materials just being sort of freely available to anyone who's interested, I think is really helpful, because it is a burden for people to have to constantly be the person who's like, okay, well, let me explain how to use they, them pronouns in a way that sounds comfortable and opening or welcoming, not opening. And so if that's sort of like almost done as like a third-party educational resource, I think that could be really helpful.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think this goes a little bit more deeper how our HR departments actually work, and it needs kind of a reinvention, because I feel like that our company website, not mine, but in general, how the company website looks like. When you're putting job advertisements, does it make sure that the job advertisements looks like that we are a diverse company? So how do we put it out there so that people don't have to go and search for it? But when they see this out there, and they know that this is a company that they are very, that everybody is welcome in, and we actually value diversity. So how to do that externally in a way that it's very clear from the company website, the job placements advertisement that we put out.
Absolutely. I think that really then takes the onus off queer people to have to search that out actively, and especially for I know we spoke before in India about sort of new people coming into the industry, and when you're making that transition from education into industry, and the difficulty of finding places that are accepting of diversity and inclusion and stuff like that. So yeah, definitely that would be something that would take the onus off us to do that. Fantastic. And we've had a question as well from one of the attendees of how can you help to change the mindsets of those you work with from tolerance to acceptance, and have you got any examples of being able to do that at work?
That's a really tough one. I think that I don't know that that's something that's a reasonable thing to try to do on an individual basis. I think we've all probably experienced within our families and our close friend groups instances where that's been challenging. I think overall, not on if you're looking at a population level, not at an individual level, the most important thing is exposure and normalizing queer people and queer issues. It's like the example with the pronouns, right? It's not about requiring everyone to state their pronouns, because that in and of itself could be harmful, but rather just normalizing the practice of it so that people get exposed to it, and it stops seeing like something other, right? And it becomes more acceptable for those individuals.
Yes, and I should add one point, is that I think a lot of it is one-on-one conversation. And again, people who are in a position of privilege can have these conversations. Sometimes there's a lot of pushback, and again, depends on the place, but having this continuous conversation as much as we can, I think that really helps. But I don't think there's a clear and easy solution to that, to change people's mind, because when people are coming actually to work, they're already adults, and they have preformed ideas about not only about just LGBTQ community, but about pretty much everything else.
Absolutely. And we've had another question in the Q&A box asking, would you feel comfortable expressing your pronouns within an interview process before starting a new role? And what do you think is the best method of being an ally to a new team member?
That's something I've actually been wrestling with recently, is pronouns and interviews. It's tempting to say I don't want to use they them pronouns in an interview because there could be an unconscious bias or conscious bias on the interviewer's part. But on the other hand, if that's the kind of workplace I'm interviewing for, I would want to know that right away, because I don't want to get a job at a company and find out that the employees aren't supportive of who I am. I don't want to go into a position where I need to hide that. And that's still something I'm coming to terms with, I think, just because it's new to me. I've only been publicly using them for a month, but that's how I feel about it right now. Is you might as well, because you don't want to be in a position where you come out later and that's an issue for you.
I think that's a really interesting point, Zach. And I guess I'm not in that position, so I hadn't thought about it. But I think that your point about unconscious bias is really it's really important, right? Because we've all heard the examples of the experiments where resumes have been sent with different names on them, and you see the response rates are different, right, between different names of different ethnicities. And I think the same thing would apply in this case. And unconscious bias runs very deeply in our psychology. I think if you go on some Harvard psychology website, you can take an unconscious bias test on the internet, right? And I did that, and I read this book called Blind Spot that was about unconscious bias, and I took the test, and it turns out I have an unconscious bias against gay people, right? And I'm a gay man, and so if I have that, then I guarantee you there's a large percentage of the population, the heterosexual population, that has that. So it's really a big issue for us to combat.
Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, in terms of sort of like secondhand experience, I've advised many graduating seniors who I've had amazing transgender students. And many of them have sort of wrestled with that, if I write them a recommendation letter, do they want to use they, them, their pronouns, or do they want to use, she or he? And that is a really difficult and really vulnerable position to be in, of like, well, I'm just going to get my first job and I don't know what it's going to be like out there in industry. And I have been incredibly impressed by the bravery of many of these individuals to just be their authentic selves and say, well, I use they, them, their pronouns, and if they don't want me for that, then I don't want them. And it's definitely a hard decision, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that is a hard decision. I was actually coming to that point. I think at this point in most of our careers, that we kind of have that option to choose. But I think lots of students were just coming out from school. And I think somebody wrote in one of the chat messages, going to school in Oklahoma, that you don't have the choice. And it is kind of a decision that, am I going to take this job or not? And I don't think there's an easy solution to that, but I think that is something that sometimes I think quite a bit. And I have seen in panels that when you are just starting your career for the entry-level job, what are you going to do? Because there aren't a lot of jobs. If you find a job that you think is perfect for you, it's kind of almost becomes a choice that you are going to be your authentic self or not. And I would, if I am in that shoes, I would probably rather take that job and see how it is out there and how those people can I bring a change? Can those people be educated? And it's probably not always true, but I feel like taking that chance is probably often worth it. So.
Definitely worthwhile if it means you end up in a place that's going to be, a good fit and good for you, and that is accepting. Absolutely. And another question, one more on this topic from the panel before we move on. From the attendees before we move on. But one of our attendees has asked, as a straight person, what is the most important thing for them to do to demonstrate support?
One of the best things, in my opinion, that you can do as somebody outside of the LGBTQ communities is to self-educate. I forget who said it earlier. Somebody had said, it's tiring to field questions all the time about gender or about sexuality. And some people are willing to do it. I don't have a problem answering questions, but a lot of people just don't have any interest in it. It's too much effort, which is totally valid. One of the best things that you can do as an ally is do research on the things that you have questions about. If you're just starting to learn about transgender people, for example, go to a site like the Human Rights Campaign, go to the Transgender Law Center and learn about some of the issues that we deal with. Because it sucks to be a trans person and have to explain all these problems that we live with. And taking the burden off of trans people or of queer people generally is a huge thing, for me personally, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I will be forever grateful to the handful of trans people in my community that have let me ask questions and make mistakes and, and sort of just practice and educate. But at the same time, that's exhausting, I'm sure, and really depends on the person's sort of capacity to continually put that information out there. But I would just say, like, first of all, to the panelists that asked that, like, thank you for asking that question. Just the fact that you're asking that question is huge. It shows like an openness to self-educate and to listen and to be receptive. And particularly, I think in the general community, there's a lot of, the broader society, there's a lot of confusion about transgender individuals and they, them, their pronouns. And the more sort of that we can all educate ourselves to be supportive and speak up, I think the that will go a long way.
Yeah, I agree with what both Zach and Cassie have said, and I think all those points are completely valid. I agree with that. I would say not as the most important thing maybe, but as an addendum to what they're saying is really just about consistency, right? If you're educated about the issues and you sort of have aligned your moral compass of what your values are, then just applying that consistently for a couple of reasons. One, because that helps to take the burden of the education of educating people off of members of the queer community. And the other aspect of it is that you don't know who identifies or who is not out, right, in a particular environment. And so if you're consistent about how you react to gay slurs or misgendering people, then that does a service to those individuals, regardless of whether or not they are there to hear it.
Yeah, and even if it's consistency in, say, if someone's pronouns, using that regardless of whether or not the person is present. If you're discussing, this project that so-and-so is working on, use the correct pronouns even if that person isn't present. That's so, important. It's such an important sign of respect.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you all for sharing those. I think they're all very important. Very good to share with with the non-LGBTQ people watching. So fantastic. And I think we've got probably time for one more question. So I'd like to just touch on intersectionality then. So it's it's very common for many members of the LGBT community, being interconnected. The nature of social categorizations such as race, class, sexuality, identity, gender, they all overlap. Do we feel that this is currently being acknowledged within the life sciences space, and how can we encourage more people to share their experiences of intersectionality? Anindya, I know you had a lot of thoughts on this.
Again, I think that things are changing for better, but I think even within the community, that understanding of intersectionality is not complete. So even educating ourselves is, I think, the first good step, understanding that what intersectionality actually means for all of us, and educate people and bring this up. I mean, I think have forums at work when you actually talk about these issues. But yes, I think there's a lot of good efforts, good faith efforts right now, but I think we really need to do more.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that at all? No, that's fine. Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing, India. I think that is about all we have time for today. But thank you to everyone who's joined for sharing your lunchtime or your evening with us, and for joining in the discussion. Big thank you to Alfie, to Lucy, and to Steve at Charbonneau for making these panels and discussions possible. And a huge thank you to Anindya, Mark, Cassie, and Zach for sharing your insights and for contributing to such an important and engaging discussion. So thank you all very, very much. For those of you who'd like to continue the discussion, feel free to join the networking session following this event. There's a link in the chat. There are various links in the chat if you want to join. I think Lucy's just put one in now, so just click on that and you can meet the panel, discuss the topics we've covered today. So we're looking forward to seeing you all at our next BioTalent Social event, and you can find all the latest news about both previous and upcoming events on the biotalent.com website or on the meetup page that you used to RSVP to this event. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.